Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, welcome. My name is Dmitry Grozobinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and it is my privilege and my pleasure to welcome you to this, the opening plenary of our Geneva Trade Week 2022. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you are joining us online or in person in the room or trickling in as we speak. And to those joining me in the room, I apologize for the bait and switch with the fade out music that didn't lead to a speech 3 minutes ago. Geneva Trade Week is our attempt to strengthen and improve the experience of anyone participating in the World Trade Organization's public forum. This is a week that many people who have jobs and interests all over the spectrum set aside to tune into trade policy to try to catch up, engage, and input into vital discussions that shape the world. We, as Geneva Trade Platform, seek to improve that experience through a mix of panels, receptions, working breakfasts, and sessions for young learners seeking to understand how to gain a career in trade policy or trade law. And we hope you find some of them valuable. We encourage you to check out our agenda at genevatradeweek.ch, and we hope to see you at many of our sessions throughout the week. This entire week wouldn't be possible without some really hard work by some incredible people. Our own events team and the Geneva Trade Platform, led by Juanita Calabala, who's there behind about 27 screens right now, making this work seamlessly, but also the support of our colleagues at TESS, at the Thinking Ahead on Societal Change program, and across the Graduate Institute. So a big thank you goes to them. I also want to thank our funding partners, the Australian government through Australian Aid, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and the Centre for Trade and Economic Integration, who have provided the funds to make all of this possible. We have an absolutely fantastic session to start us off, organized really in the spirit of the silo-busting mandate that we were given. It is a joint session by the WTO and UNEP, but one that I know that our TESS colleagues supported the delivery of. To guide that session, please allow me to introduce our moderator and our MC for today, Aiko Lim, the Director of the Trade and Environment Division at the World Trade Organization. For as long as I've been in Geneva, he, and I suspect long before that, he has been an absolutely relentless font of energy, tempered by realism and judgment within the Centre William Rapard. And so I'm honored to hand him the reins of this, our opening plenary. Aiko, please.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. Thanks very much for those kind words as well. We are really happy to be able to do this with you today, together with the Graduate Institute, with Geneva Trade Week, and of course with our friends in the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, TESS. It's a fantastic occasion, I think, as we look towards what happens next following MC12, and as well as all the things happening in the environment world as to how the trade community is embracing, engaging, and moving forward. And I can think of no better person to begin this high-level opening than my Deputy Director General, Jean-Marie Paugam, not just because he's my Deputy Director General, but because Jean-Marie and Dimitri said, very kindly said, the energy I have, my energy is very modest compared to Jean-Marie's, who's very relentlessly pushing forward, if I can say, a lot of thinking on what does sustainability mean for trade in general, and of course for more WTO in particular. And he has also previously been the chairperson of the Committee on Trade and Environment. So I think, Jean-Marie, if I can ask you to come to the podium and perhaps offer a few of your thoughts on how do we do things under trade and environment at WTO and more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, and good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's about that time. That would be my key message to start this week that I want to share when thinking about trade and sustainability. And actually, I borrow this message, the title of a very good piece of music from Miles Davis from 1968, released on an album called In a Silent Way. And the reason I'm referring to it because it was a revolution at its time. It was a time when jazz music was a little bit losing steam, getting locked into its routine, had left the dance floor, to the concert hall. And in the meanwhile, the young people of the time were doing something else. We're listening to electric music, we're listening to basically rock music. And what Miles Davis did is that he just introduced a binary rock music into his jazz. And that was more or less the invention of jazz rock, which has been shaping the history of music up to today. It's about that time. So why am I saying that? Because I think that in the WTO, we face a rather comparable situation. And I'll try to explain that point by, I think we know how to do classical trade policy, trade liberalization and trade disciplines. We have inherited from the GATT a very strong model, which is based on powerful principles to regulate the movements of goods and services, such as transparency, non-discrimination, binding commitments, the rule of law. And meanwhile, there are many new dimensions of trade which have been happening in the real world economy and world trade that we do not completely grasp yet in the WTO. Climate change is impacting massively trade patterns and value chains. You know that most multinationals and governments are developing net zero strategies, in particular through decarbonation of value chains and traceability of their input. I just want to give an example about that. I was discussing last week with a major trader who was explaining to me that to sell his coffee, to buy and sell coffee to Starbucks and Nestle, he was in need to justify all the traceability and the carbon footprint of the coffee. So you won't sell coffee in the future just because of tariffs or non-tariff barrier. You have to comply with those requests from the market forces. So that's why, as our DG often mentions, it has become clear that sustainability is at the heart of the trading model of the future. And therefore, our challenge is to reconcile the classical trade policy pattern with the emerging one. We must achieve exactly what Miles Davis has achieved with his music. We must merge trade and sustainability to invent a sustainable trade policy of the future. And the good news is that we are already doing it. It has started to happen in the WTO. Our members are taking determined action toward that goal. That's why I say it's about that time. Let me just illustrate this assertion with 4 examples. The first one is, if you look at our recent MC12 conference, it was really dominated by the issues of global commons, to which the WTO has proposed some responses: the fight against the COVID, food security, fisheries sustainability. Second, the fisheries agreement, which negotiation was chaired by Santiago here on the podium, is really a landmark one. For the first time in the history of the WTO, the software of a multilateral agreement has completely shifted from trade to sustainability. The goal of the agreement was not trade for trade, trade policy to increase trade. It was really sustainable trade. It was exactly the kind of merger that I was referring to. Third, climate change has emerged as a major issue within the WTO. The World Climate Change itself was part of the outcome document of our ministerial in June. But I think this is only the tip of the iceberg. If you take a more granular look at the WTO business, you'll see that climate change is all around the place. It is in our trade policy review. It is in regional trade agreements. It is being discussed in the Council of Trade in Goods, also the Council of Trade in Services. It is a big plate on the menu of SPS and TBT discussions, sanitary and phytosanitary or technical barriers to trade. It's, of course, I think, central to the discussion of the CTE organized by the division of Holding. And fourth, you know that some of our members, actually 89 of them together, have engaged very prolific dialogues and structured discussions on trade and the environment. You know that they discuss on trade in plastics, circular economy, climate change policies, biodiversity, liberalization of environmental trades and services, fossil fuel subsidies reform that the UN Secretary General has recently called for a very ambitious reform. I think these are clear indications that the sustainable trade is on the way. The only question is, how long will it take to fully achieve the merger? And here is where civil society, academics, and other stakeholders can provide an input. I guess this is your job at the Geneva Trade Week, and actually now is the time to start. Just thank you for your invitation and for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jean-Marie. And I should also mention that, in putting this together, we benefited from our partnership with UNEP. UNEP has been a partner with us for a long time, and we have been intensifying a lot of work over recent years. And I think this conversation that we are having here today could not really be possible without having UNEP being part of it. So I have great pleasure to also introduce Madame Sheila Aggarwal-Khan, who is Director of the Economy Division at UNEP. Unfortunately, she can't join us in person, but she does have her Deputy Director here, Stephen Stone, who's in front of the seats. I should also mention, of course, Dr. Caroline Dier-Birkbeck, our constant partner in many things that we do. And thanks again, Caroline, for all the efforts. So with that, I see Sheila is online, so let me just pass to the technical people to switch to Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I use this opportunity to congratulate WTO members on the 3 ministerial statements on the environment in 2021, the one on plastics and trade, the one on trade and environmental sustainability, and then the third on fossil fuel subsidy. I think now we're at a critical time, as you all have said, when we're seeing the environmental impacts of some of the big, let's say, developments that have happened in an unsustainable manner. I was in New York last week, where there were lots of conversations about the flooding in Pakistan. And as the Secretary General said, this is climate carnage. We're, I think, at a point where we need to be looking at how do we get to a global economic model that is really sustainable and circular. And maybe I could talk of one example in particular, plastics. So we're at a point where member states at the UN Environment Assembly discussed and put forward a resolution for them to basically negotiate a global plastics agreement under the Secretariat's support of the UN Environment Programme. And they want to do this in 2 years. In the meetings I was in last week in New York, we had lots of meetings with industry actors and governments, civil society groups and all. And it was very interesting to hear from an industry perspective that solutions are possible. They're looking between brands and retailers at things like reuse and refill systems, deposit systems, take-back systems, basically keeping plastics in the economy. What they're more struggling with is, how do you get alternatives to plastics that would actually be priced better than material that is using virgin plastics? How do you get recycled material that goes back into the value chain that then becomes cheaper than using virgin plastics? And it all came back to the subsidy issue. And almost the elephant in the room, where we're seeing, well, if you want to have a circular value chain, unless you look at the fossil fuel subsidy issue and what it means for pricing, we're never going to be able to price plastics in a way that allows them to shift towards a circular economy. And this is a big question for you all over this next couple of days, to be able to think through, where do we need to go with that? How do we get the pricing of alternatives right? What is tradable? And what can be moved across borders? There were discussions about having access to plastic waste, where you have recycling facilities available in accordance with the Basel Convention. But at the same time, to be able to move that waste faster through the process so that you can create a market for recycled content. At the end of the day, we need both, on the one side, the subsidy issue looked at, and on the other hand, a way to promote sustainability and promote trade that looks at sustainable commodities. We saw lots of questions or use of terms like recyclable, compostable and all, but with everyone having a slightly different definition of the term. So really another space for engagement. And we're in close coordination with WTO to be able to look at the plastic space in there, but something for you all also to look at, to seeing what does it mean in the next 2 years, this agreement has to be negotiated. And unless we deal with some of the challenges on pricing, on the additives that are going into plastics that might be harmful in some cases, and that were causing recycling to be very difficult, because at the end of the day, you end up with that hazardous compound, which has been mixed into the plastic material. On the other hand, then you have food systems. And again, you got here, what global support to agricultural producers is 540 billion a year. We're again seeing distortions again in the way pricing is done. And the WTO Fisheries agreement that you had adopted recently actually shows there is capability to be able to, and a willingness from member states to move in this space. And so we're very, let's say, hopeful and positive that, we're in a different space globally, that different between industry actors who are showing big willingness to move forward on some of these big spaces, and at the same time, governments being able to look in a different way of how to repurpose subsidies. We think that here is a really big opportunity in the next year or two to be able to bring this to fruition, where we've been having discussions with export credit entities about what does this mean in terms of financing, what does it mean in the trade agenda. And so at the same time, on the one hand, while subsidies is an issue, on the other hand, what does it mean to create a positive enabling environment for those who are going to alternatives that are more sustainable? And how do we help to create that environment? So both from the finance and the trade space, and then what support is needed for member states to be able to move in that space. So very hopeful and hoping that these next couple of days will be very, let's say, constructive in being able to chart forward a way in which we can move these to, let's say, to completion, as you did with the fisheries work. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And this concludes the sort of opening session of our briefing this morning. And I think both speakers, and then particularly Sheila Aggarwal-Khan, asked some very specific questions about the interrelationship between environment and trade, and actually in a very practical way, in terms of how can trade policy do more to enable environmental objectives. At the same time, this interrelationship of how trade affects the environment, as well as the fact that everything we trade depends on the environment, I think sets us up quite nicely for a deeper discussion, which I'm here very happily joined by a very esteemed panel that will try to get us a bit deeper into the issues on trade and environment today at the WTO. So if you allow me, I'll just start by introducing the panel. I have, starting from my right, Santiago Wills, who's the ambassador and permanent representative of Colombia to the WTO. He's already been mentioned a few times as chair of the Fisheries Subsidies negotiations. So great that he could be with us this morning. Then I have Ambassador Claire Kelly, who is the ambassador and permanent representative of New Zealand to the WTO. She's also in her role coordinator on fossil fuel subsidy reform. It's a pleasure that you could join us. We have Ambassador Jose Valencia, who is the ambassador and permanent representative of Ecuador to the WTO, and a co-coordinator of the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmental sustainable plastics trade, which we've also heard a little bit about this morning in the opening remarks. And finally, we have Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Martin Moen of Canada, who's also a co-coordinator of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. And that, again, is another area of work that you've heard about this morning. So a great panel here to take us through this discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have Ambassador Simon Manley, who is the chair of the Committee on Trade and Environment. He was intending to come, but there were some last-minute changes that he couldn't make it. He asked me just to say a few words about the committee. And I think most of you here in the room, those who follow trade and environment, will know that the committee has been in existence for quite some time. And I think this is a committee that provides a very unique space in the whole WTO system. There is no other place like this in the WTO, because when you look at the WTO system, the way our bodies and committees are structured, they are against an agreement. Committee on Trade and Environment doesn't have an agreement. Some see this as a weakness, some see this as a strength. I think it lies possibly somewhere between the two. But in the meantime, you have a great opportunity, because in the Committee on Trade and Environment, you can have the type of discussions that are, let's say, more difficult to have in other WTO bodies, simply because of the structure of these other bodies. And in the Trade and Environment Committee, you can have that discussion about the nexus of trade and environment, environment and trade. That's essentially what the committee was set up for. And Simon also wanted me to sort of mention a bit about the important paragraph from MC12, how this paragraph, not necessarily saying anything you don't already know, but I think draws even more recognition to the role that the Committee on Trade and Environment can and should play at the trade and environment interface. And of course, the language of that particular paragraph recognizes the importance of contributing and addressing in mitigating the challenges of climate change. So there's a lot there for the committee to take forward, but the committee is not doing it alone, of course. All of the initiatives that you've mentioned, that we have mentioned this morning, they also report in a way, it's not a formal reporting, but they do update the Committee on Trade and Environment, and they do have that discussion in the committee as well. So there are very important links here towards let's say, a critical mass of initiatives and a formal committee at the WTO, which are both addressing the issue of trade and environment. So that's enough for me as moderator. We have time for one round of initial comments from the panel. We'll turn to you, the audience, both online and in the auditorium. We have some over 250, I've been told, joining online, so it's a great audience. And I ask each of the panelists, if they can, to keep their remarks or initial remarks to something like 4 or 5 minutes. Let me start with Santiago Wills. Many of you have heard of the great success from MC12. It took, however, 20 years to get there, but they did get there. It was a very significant result. And if I could ask you, Santiago, why do you think that came about, and how do you see things going forward? How do we go forward now that we have the fishery subsidies agreement? Thank you.
Thank you, Ho, and thanks the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Trade Platform for this very kind invitation. I'm honored to be here with these excellent colleagues and panelists today. Well, very quickly, and given that we only have 4 to 5 minutes for the opening remarks to explain how a 21-year-old negotiation came about, I'll try to skip some steps and try to go to the center of it. So something that I heard the UNEP colleague as well talking about earlier was what are we trying to remedy with some of the negotiations we are in, and what we were trying to remedy with the fisheries subsidies negotiations. And of course, this is based on academic research. There's around $35 billion of subsidies granted every year to the fisheries sector. And from those, it's estimated that around $22 billion a year are considered as harmful fisheries subsidies. So what was our mandate in the fisheries subsidies negotiations? To prohibit and to eliminate those harmful subsidies. Those include subsidies that go to illegal and reported and unregulated fishing, what we know as IUU fishing, those contributing to overcapacity, to overfishing, those that end up in the hands of fishers that are still fishing overexploited or overfished stocks. There's a bunch of different types of subsidies that could eventually become harmful. The big difficulty, and this is one of the big reasons why it took 21 years to negotiate, was what is a harmful subsidy? For every subsidy that we could say, this is harmful, there were several exceptions. Members saying, not in my case. In my case, this subsidy is used this way or that way, so it's actually a beneficial subsidy. So it took very, very long to try to narrow down what the mandate really wanted and what we wanted to do as the WTO membership. So that's just one of the difficulties. Of course, there's many more. We were trying to fit this last piece of a puzzle on subsidies on an even bigger puzzle that was full of already existing regulation with rights and obligations to members, and now we're negotiating how to show some self-restraint in how they grant subsidies. So it wasn't an easy negotiation. So what did we achieve? On June 17th, this present year, ministers at the ministerial conference adopted an agreement on fisheries subsidies that tackles subsidies to IUU fishing, that I was just explaining, subsidies granted to fishing overfished stocks, and mainly subsidies as well granted to fish on the unregulated high seas. Those are the three major disciplines we have. There are two other disciplines that are more of I think they're more than just best efforts, but they're about showing self-restraint in when you grant subsidies to those vessels not flying the flag of the subsidizing member. And again, subsidies as well for the unassessed stocks, to fish unassessed stocks. Apart from that, we have a very strong pillar of transparency and notifications. And that was one of those other elements complicating the negotiations. Lack of information. How much actual subsidies do each member grant? Or to whom? Or what's the value? To fish what kind of stocks? So all of that was a big question mark throughout 2021 years. We're trying to correct that through the agreement as well. So we have a very strong, robust pillar on notifications and transparency. And on top of that, of course, we have institutional arrangements. We have more of a horizontal nature type of issues like dispute settlement. So for any subsidy that deals with that is being dealt with the agreement, there is final recourse to dispute settlement. There will be a fisheries subsidies committee established in the organization to have the type of dialogue we have to have between members. Overall, it's a pretty big agreement. The biggest takeaway for me of this agreement is the precedent it creates for future negotiations in the WTO. And that is that for the first time, an agreement that deals with subsidies in this case, with economics, the trigger for the discipline, the trigger for the prohibition is based on sustainability. So when a sustainability criterion is met, the discipline, or not met actually, is triggered. When you have IUU fishing, the discipline is triggered. So, and I think Ho was talking about this, or maybe Jean-Marie earlier today, the change in the mindset that was needed in negotiators was key, moving from trade negotiations, so these kind of trade-offs and price distortions, market distortions, etc., into sustainability-based negotiations. That was key, and I think that was a key component in the outcome. So what now? Now we have an agreement. Next steps. The agreement itself and the decision by ministers adopting the protocol that in turn has annexed the agreement. We have a second mandate, and that is to keep negotiating. So now we have a second wave of negotiations to try to enhance further the disciplines we currently have. What else? We have now to accept the agreement. So for the agreement to be implementable, to enter into force, 2/3 of the membership will have to accept the agreement formally, deposit their instrument of acceptance to the depositary, that is the DG, and once 2/3 of the membership has done that, the agreement will enter into force and implement. The agreement as now is just a piece of paper. It's now for members to implement it and make it a reality. But I think we took a very important first step in changing and making this process forward into ocean sustainability in our case, but also to create this precedent for future negotiations in the WTO in this past ministerial conference. I'll leave it there for now, but I'll be happy to respond to any questions after. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Santiago. That was so clear and very concise as well. Thank you so much. And I think it sets up a really great agenda for everyone. Thank you, Caroline, for leading the applause. Much deserved. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Martin Moen of Canada, who is Canada is a co-coordinator with Costa Rica and of course other countries on the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. And this has been a huge highlight over the last few years on environmental sustainability at the WTO. You're covering a wide range of issues. and if you could take the audience through some of the work that you're doing, where you are today. And if I might ask my own question, inspired by Santiago, which is, are you sensing a change of mindset, I mean, or how do we get to a change of mindset? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this this opportunity. And I think before getting into an update, I'll just step back a bit and talk a bit about the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussion, TESD, because it's easy as we work away at it and discuss and come up with ideas in its context to forget about how innovative it is. What it is it's an approach inside the WTO, member driven, to have discussions that are outside any of the formal structures. So we're not at this point negotiating, we're not making formal proposals at each other in a formal committee, but rather we decided that in order to move forward the work on environment, we needed to complement the work that was being done in the CTE and elsewhere with something that was more informal and something that was more amongst like-minded. Now, the idea, of course, is not to keep it there forever. The idea is to then use this format to generate ideas, to engage outside of the WTO membership, and to move forward. And we have been finding it, I think, very useful. And ministers in December of last year did issue a statement in support of the work of this group of ministers of the countries participating. And on that basis, we've engaged in a work plan now. We've set out a formal work plan where we've moved from very broad-based exploratory discussions to something a little more concrete. And we're doing focused discussions within our group to try and see what's possible, where could we head, what kind of outcomes could we aim for in a few topic areas. So in the area of trade-related climate measures, in the area of environmental goods and services, in the area of the circular economy, and in the area of subsidies. And we are beginning this work plan discussion not from scratch, right? There's been quite a bit of discussion within the group, a lot of analytical work that we've tapped into. And our goal now is to work in a group to come up with ideas for outcomes in a WTO context in these areas. Now, as a co-convener, we're not presupposing anything. And one of the things that we do try to make sure we can maintain in the group is an understanding that, first of all, these are critical issues. These are issues that require action. And these are also issues where outcomes and approaches may have to be complex to deal with the reality that different members of the organization have different circumstances. We are moving forward. And I think in response to your question, I can say that there is a lot of energy. And I think sometimes being outside of the formal processes can generate the energy that you can then eventually bring back in at the right moment. And we've also taken the approach of TESD to ensure that we have a better engagement of stakeholders. So we've invited a range of stakeholders to participate directly, and we've used this to tap into expertise. And we've had a very high level of engagement in this regard. And we want to keep doing this as we drive towards MC13. And I say MC13 because, again, this is not just a talk shop. Our goal is to think of outcomes, initiatives, ideas with open mind that we can then work on in the WTO context, not as a replacement for the work ongoing, but as a supplement. And I just close off by saying that in the discussions in TESD, I think one of the things that's become really clear is the extent of creativity that there is out there right now in the world on how to deal with environmental issues, and how the nexus between trade and environment, issues like subsidies, standards, border measures, and a whole range of these related issues can yield policy approaches that can have a positive effect. And we're working very much in a brainstorming, but along those specific topics that I've talked about with a goal of getting to outcomes. So I won't go any further. I'll leave more time for others and for questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. And I think, the energy that you mentioned is certainly something for those of you who are not necessarily following this on a daily basis, will notice if you were to follow the structured discussions. I mean, they have really energized, I would say, this area of discussion at the WTO. Just the sheer number of meetings and working groups is one thing. And the other thing is that the delegations are actually, they are participating very actively together with stakeholders. So you really mapped out a very interesting new way of going, I would say, at WTO. And in terms of energy, I have to go to Ambassador Jose Valencia, who's also been very energetic in the area of plastics, together with the other co-coordinators, on trying to better look at, and actually going further than that, in terms of what contribution WTO or this group of members can do to the fight against plastics, to addressing plastics pollution, and finding ways to have more environmentally sustainable plastics trade. So Ambassador Valencia, again, you already conducted a lot of work, but it'd be great if you could spotlight a bit the main highlights of your work, the direction you're going, and if anything you might be able to say about how this work can support the UN treaty negotiations on plastics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and a cordial greeting to the ambassadors and the panelists at this event. I also appreciate here the presence of Jean-Marie Paugam, the Deputy Director of the WTO, and Sheila Aggarwal-Khan from UNEP. She was online a few minutes ago, addressing us with very important issues and perspectives. And also to Caroline, here, the director of Caroline Dierbierbeck, the director of TESS, an excellent counterpart in many of our different issues. So thank you certainly for your moderation, the director of the trade division, Ike. Well, first, it's a pleasure here to also notice the presence of members of the platform in this room, and also the ones that are connected online. You mentioned that a very important number of people following this session. Ecuador really appreciates very much the opportunity to interact with stakeholders who follow the multilateral trade and environment agenda in Geneva with interest and certainly with dedication. I will focus my few remarks on the multilateral efforts, as you mentioned, that are underway in the field of trade and plastics. Ecuador is co-coordinator of the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution and Sustainable Plastics Trade, the IDP initiative, together with Australia, Barbados, China, Fiji, and Morocco. The initiative is an effort that brings together 74 countries, representing economies of different sizes and countries with populations of diverse size as well. They belong to all geographical regions. But before referring to the projection of the work of the IDP, as you requested to do, Mr. Moderator, I allow myself to briefly refer to a very important factor of the context of this issue in the multilateral arena. And this is, of course, the United Nations Environmental Assembly deciding last March to establish an intergovernmental negotiation committee to move forwards towards the adoption of a binding multilateral instrument on plastic pollution. The negotiating committee will begin its work in November of this year in Punta del Este, Uruguay. The Assembly granted a mandate to be fulfilled in a 2-year term. That is an ambitious goal, not only because of the subject matter, but also because of the time allotted to achieve it. Let us remember that other international instruments on polluting products have taken longer to achieve results. However, the self-imposed goal only highlights the importance of the issue of plastic pollution at a global level and the commitment of the states to reach quick and efficient agreements. As in other matters that concern the environment, time is against us due to the severe impact and adverse effects accumulated in the environment due to the pollution produced by human activities. At this point, I am tempted to present figures and projections of the urgency of addressing the problem of plastic pollution in our planet, especially in sensitive areas as oceans, rivers, lakes. However, the audience knows these statistics firsthand. Therefore, I will limit myself to reiterate a figure that has been around many times, but is very important matter from the multilateral trade standpoint, because that certainly highlights the relevance to work from the trade perspective on these issues. The plastics trade moves 340 million metric tons of plastic products yearly. This figure represents 5% of global trade and is equivalent to $1 trillion. This without taking into considerations hidden plastic flows, most of them related to packaging. The IDP is a specific response to come to the specific issue here at the WTO. I say this is a specific response of the states to contribute from a commercial perspective in the matter. And I want to be clear, this is not the first time that issues dealing with plastic pollution and plastics has been considered at the WTO, nor are there no other ways in which the member states of the organization have not expressed their concern on the subject. In fact, the WTO, the World Trade Organization Secretariat has reported that until a few months ago, the countries had officially notified the organization of more than 130 measures on the issue, from the prohibition on non-degradable plastic covers to import licenses for plastic waste. How do we expand and systematize the export of WTO members on plastic pollution? The ministerial declaration of IDP members in December 2021 identified a primary work agenda: improve transparency on trade flows, supply chains, and public policies, strengthen regulatory cooperation and coordination with other multilateral efforts, identify policies and mechanisms that constitute experiences to be shared, and lay the foundations for cooperation and technical assistance, especially towards the least developed countries and as SIDS. The 2021 declaration of the IDP did not stop at a plurilateral pronouncement that, although it welcomes almost half of the WTO members, does not represent an official decision of the whole organization. In addition to a more detailed work program that will guide the initiative in 2022, the interaction with non-state stakeholders is explicitly contemplated, whose vision and contributions of the stakeholders, will contribute to the shaping of the dialogue's results. With a view to the 13th Ministerial Conference, the IDP wants to interact with other official instances of the WTO, with the Secretariat of the organization, but also with UNTAD, UNEP, the World Customs Organization, and we also with other stakeholders in order to prepare and to think in meaningful deliverables and outcomes that will include all members of the organizations and represent solid future agreements. We are looking at whether members can come together, for instance, on how to deal with plastic pollution by supporting trade and in substitutes, alternatives, and technologies, something that the representative of UNEP mentioned earlier. How to individually and commonly apply best practice trade policies to support the reduction of plastic pollution, and how to support developing countries, including SIDS and LDCs, to address this problem. With this purpose in mind, I would like on this occasion to invite the stakeholders who are present in this room and online, and even those who, for whatever reason, have not been able to join us today, to contribute to the dialogue on plastics, how we should aim to achieve by MC13 what's their view on the IDP's contribution to the global response. Let us know how their work, research, and how that work and research might support our goals and MC13, the Ministerial Conference in the 13, and beyond. This problem doesn't belong just to governments. That is very clear for the initiative. The impacts of it are felt across society, and as representatives of civil society, they have an essential voice at the table. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. When you work on trade and environment, one word keeps cropping up, which is coherence. And I think plastics is one of the examples where the WTO members really started very early to try to develop that coherence with the UN. And as you mentioned, the work on UNEA and the international plastics pollution is really very inspirational to show that WTO members can actually develop these bridges to see how they can support what is essentially an environmental negotiation. As Jean-Marie said early this morning, it's a very different type of negotiation. It's not trade, it's not market access, but yet a role here for WTO. So thank you very much for that. And last but not least, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Claire Kelly of New Zealand. She has possibly the most challenging task here as the coordinator or co-coordinator of fossil fuel subsidy reform, but a major game changer. If governments, if members can really get behind this initiative, this, I think, a lot of the environmental community would really sit up. Again, it's a fast-growing initiative, many things happening. And I'd just like to turn the floor to you, Ambassador Kelly, to maybe update us and to tell us a little bit about how things are going in this particular initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ho, for moderating us today. Thank you to UNEP and the WTO for the invitation to join the briefing. It's my pleasure to provide an update on one aspect of the trade and environmental work going on in the WTO, which is taking place under the Joint Ministerial Statement on Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. New Zealand's proud to coordinate this effort. We're joined by 47 WTO members as co-sponsors from a range of developed and developing countries and across many regions. This number of co-sponsors continues to grow. Most recently, we welcomed Samoa and Paraguay, and the initiative remains open to all interested members. This broad and growing support we see as clear recognition that the trade community wants to collaborate and contribute to global efforts to address climate change, as we've heard from all speakers today. For fossil fuel subsidy reform in particular, it also reflects the degree of momentum we've seen building on this issue, particularly in APEC and in the Glasgow Climate Pact at COP26. Subsidies are a long-standing and well-established trade issue, and as with the Fisheries Subsidy Agreement, it makes sense to pursue their multilateral reform within the rules-based architecture and transparency frameworks of the WTO. Through our joint ministerial statement, co-sponsors are explicitly recognising the adverse trade, social environment, and environmental impacts of fossil fuel subsidies and the impacts of these on investment in clean technology. We have committed to the rationalisation and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies along a clear timeline. The statement makes it clear that reform needs to take into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise possible adverse impacts. It's never been a one-size-fits-all approach, and this is a fundamental principle that'll guide our efforts as we go forward. Co-sponsors have agreed to share information and experiences with the aim of continuing to build a supportive international setting for addressing fossil fuel subsidies at the WTO and to assist domestic reform efforts. At MC12, co-sponsors adopted a work program to guide our efforts over the coming months. The purpose is to help in our objective to elaborate concrete options for advancing this issue ahead of MC13. We've set ourselves a time frame that we can move towards to take forward action in a coherent and transparent manner. What we envisage under the work program is dedicated meetings on transparencies, on topics such as transparency, and developing better and common understandings of relevant definitions and concepts, as well as on development-related issues and social issues that are associated with reform. We are looking forward to advancing this work at a meeting of co-sponsors next week, focusing on transparency issues and ways that we as a group of ambitious members can coordinate to support progress, including across other relevant international processes. This meeting will be open to all WTO members and as well as to stakeholders whose contributions we welcome and value. Of course, as we take this work forward, we haven't lost sight of the current context and the energy crisis in which we find ourselves. And we recognise that there's difficult times ahead, but we don't want to lose sight of the longer term collective objective. Rising fossil fuels reinforce the need to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean, green energy systems. We must not let temporary relief measures in response to the crisis become embedded if we are to meet the increasingly urgent targets set out in the Paris Agreement. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to update the group. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Claire. And I think you've heard, from the session, really very clear and very practical sort of interventions here about what's on the table, where the work is, and what possible things could be taken going forward. And I think we're doing quite well in terms of time, I hope, to the organizers. And we have an opportunity to take some questions and responses. I thought the most efficient way to do this is maybe I ask Marianne to help me to find 2 questions from the online audience, 2 questions from the auditorium. We'll pass back to the panel for a round of interventions, and let's see how far we get. So Marianne, please.
Thank you. So representing the online audience, I would have a couple of questions for the panel to consider. Firstly, a broader question, looking across all the panel members in your respective areas. What could or should be the key concrete next steps to shift to the 2-beat rock, jazz, fusion, trade sustainability policy that Deputy DG Paugam was calling for? So, in other words, we have these instruments and dialogues in place now, or in the pipeline, but what needs to happen next in as concrete terms as possible between now and MC13? So that's a generic question for all of you to consider from your respective areas. Then secondly, a slightly more focused question, but building on the one before, and equally for all the panelists to consider as well, is given the unique role that Committee on Trade and Environment plays, as we've heard, how can we build further momentum and action on environment and trade and sustainability through the CTE moving forward? So a couple of questions from the online to kick things off, but then over to you, Ho, and the audience.
Well, thanks. I think those are 2 very fantastic questions, because I think the panel will all have something to say on it. So thank you very much. So your opportunity now in the auditorium, I would like to pick some hands. I see 2 hands, actually, the lady at the back and the front, the gentleman in the front. If you could introduce who you are, that would also be great.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Stéphanie Noël. I'm a trade lawyer in Geneva. I'm working on issues relating to trade and the environment, and I'm asking a question in relation to TESD, and especially about the dialogue with external stakeholders. So I have actually 2 questions on behalf of stakeholders who are outsiders and are not participating in this discussion. I would like to know how we could follow the progress of this discussion, what's on the table, what are the key outputs of the discussion. And secondly, I would like to know whether you're open to other participants and how stakeholders could engage if they have something to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Very directed question to TESS. And let's take the other question here, please.
Thank you very much. An excellent panel, very interesting discussion. My name is Peter Probe. I'm Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches, but a trade lawyer by profession, actually. My question is for Ambassador Kelly. With regard to this very important and very new area of work on fossil fuel subsidies reform, could you give any assessment at this point as to how swiftly this might be brought to some sort of practical impact, given the very constrained timeline that the planet imposes on us and as illustrated to us by the science? Or do you envisage another 2-decade plus process as we've seen on the fisheries issue?
Okay, actually, I think we have a bit of time. So because you guys made an effort to come to the auditorium, I can take another third question if there's a third question. I'm torn. Okay, the lady was quicker, but if you don't mind, I'll go to her first. Sorry. And I'll come to you if we have a time, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Eleanor de Ancizu. I'm an attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. We have been following the IDP, and unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to follow the other processes. Not, I mean, just because the IDP has taken a lot of our time so far, but we're very interested in the other processes. And my question was about the fossil fuel subsidies process and the question on plastic pollution. As we know, there's a link between plastic pollution that was also addressed between subsidies to plastic. So I was wondering if there's any possibility to work on that, or if others have been willing to work on this, and where are we on that topic? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The link between plastics and fossil fuel. So you have a great menu of questions here, 2 which are more general to all of you, and then 3 others which are very specific to your particular initiatives. Can I suggest we just go through the panel and you pick up the questions as you heard them, and maybe starting with Martin and we work through. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'll start with the general question, and it's from the perspective of co-convener of TESD. I'm not certain where we're going to head. I really am not, and I'm not because I want this organic discussion to evolve, because it's gotten to where it is by allowing members to bring ideas forward. But what I can say is a couple of things. First of all, the agreement on fisheries shows us that the WTO can be a place where agreements can be reached that are primarily environmental in nature. They have economic impacts, of course, and they deal with economic policy measures such as subsidies, yes. But the reason why we did that was for environmental reasons. So that shows we can do it. So that's good. And of course, we can go further on fisheries. It's a big success, and we can build on it in that specific area, but also more generally. The second thing that's come very apparent in the TESD discussions is the extent to which policies that have an impact on trade, that are trade related, are being used by governments, and increasingly used by governments for example, climate objectives or other environmental objectives. And in that context, having discussions that are fully aware of what is going on, and also try to deal with how can we make the rules appropriate, how can we use the WTO type of rules, the WTO context to support, to facilitate that policy work, and perhaps even to create new tools. So that's the kind of discussion we're having, but it's very much, we've made the most progress when we've opened it up and generated ideas as a group so that we get the full diversity there. In terms of how are we going to let the outside world know? Well, as we proceed and move along the areas that we've identified for work, we do intend to turn these into something that we then share with the broader membership, share with the outside world, and certainly we'll do that. In terms of stakeholder engagement, we have every intention of continuing stakeholder engagement. So if there are stakeholders who believe they have something particularly interesting to share, absolutely reach out to us, reach out to me, and we can see whether it will fit into the program of work we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Valencia.
Thank you. I will start with a general comment as well about the future steps. I mentioned briefly during my intervention, but basically our initiative, the IDP initiative on plastic pollution, is certainly a brand new initiative. We started not a few months even ago. So we're in sort of initial steps towards building what we have to do. Not we are starting from scratch, because as you also mentioned, Lim, there are already a lot of work done in the past, especially from the Secretariat, trying to see what the countries have done already on the matter, different instances, especially on notification of different trade measures and initiatives on the matter. But once again, building on that, we plan to work ahead on the issue of plastic pollution and how to support or how to think about supporting trade in substitutes, alternatives, and technologies. Something that is really part of the solution of the problem of plastic pollution. A second line of work certainly will be in trying to find out the best practices and also to identify trade policies of countries that are being enacted in order to reduce plastic pollution. That's very important because we learned that developed and developing nations, countries from different sizes, etc., they're already taking measures that are supported by trade on that direction. So we want to have some sort of a comprehensive approach and to learn each other what we are doing and what is applicable for everyone. And third, certainly is the issue of supporting developing countries. This is, we believe, a very important part of the solution, if you want, because as we know, the plastic pollution has many other situations against the environment. They have a commonality. They are present in the whole planet. You cannot just make a compartment of those issues and say this is affecting this country or the other. We are all involved. We are all involved, even in a individual basis. We are all consumers of plastic goods or practice plastic elements in our lives, daily lives. So working in order to support those developing countries matters in the way that we provide in countries that need specific technologies to go ahead with different programs that involves trade and pollution in direct or indirect way. So that's the three directions that we will follow in the future. I should also mention something else, that at the same time, we plan to follow closely the negotiations of the binding instrument that is going to take place beginning next November. Certainly the WTO, or from the WTO, we have to support those negotiations. There have been a lot of talk about that among members, and I think there is a commitment to doing so. And the Secretariat of the WTO is already communicating and coordinating with the UNEP and other stakeholders. So our work in progress will be also to keep in touch with that central initiative, and in the future, of course, in both directions, the job of the initiative and the job of the UNEP with the binding instrument will be closely related, and we have to work together in order to see how we support each other in the best manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Valencia. Ambassador Kelly.
Thank you. On the two general questions, as I understood them, what could be the next step to concrete disciplines? I think we have to go where the momentum is, inside and outside the WTO, and there certainly seems to be an appetite for looking at subsidies and the environmentally harmful impacts thereof. And I think that's across all aspects of the WTO's work. We certainly can't shy away from the impact of, or the environmentally harmful impacts of agricultural domestic support, for example. So I think we're moving towards a holistic consideration of subsidies, of good subsidies, bad subsidies, and what the WTO can do in that regard to act to discipline environmentally harmful aspects of subsidisation. Just speaking from New Zealand's perspective, we do think that another contribution is through pathfinder initiatives between smaller groups of countries. And New Zealand has created one of those in the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. Sorry, my mind just went blank for a minute there. Negotiation, which is between a group of small countries to look specifically at trade measures which can mitigate climate change aspects or further climate change objectives. And that agreement is not, that negotiation is not yet concluded, but when it is, we think that will serve as a demonstration to WTO members of what specific concrete steps can be taken by countries in their trade policy and in their trade practice to contribute towards climate change mitigation efforts. On the CTE and how we use it to build further momentum, am I correct, Ho? That's the second question. I mean, I think Ho put his finger on one of the very important elements of it, and that is that it is not connected to a specific negotiation. It doesn't concern the operation of an agreement. Therefore, its deliberative function is a very important one, and it can be a forum for open, constructive conversations about the environmental objective of policies that intersect with trade policy. And I think that and the confidence and trust building that that could engender is a really important part of the CTE's mandate. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. I think that was really useful, that last bit on the CTE. Santiago, any bits of advice, lessons, thoughts?
Yes, well, I'll address the first question on concrete next steps to move forward. At least that's the headline that stuck in my mind after the question. In our case, we're in a very particular situation because we have now an outcome from the June ministerial. But as I was mentioning at the beginning of my presentation, now we have two work streams that came out of the outcome as well. One is to accept the agreement. So now every member will now go back to the jurisdiction and take care of their domestic procedures in such a way in which they hopefully quickly can accept the agreement. Once 2/3 of the membership have accepted the agreement, it will enter into force. Then we'll have the established committee on fisheries subsidies in the WTO. The notification obligations will be binding, all other obligations will be binding, etc. So one work stream that is very, very important, very urgent, is to accept the agreement now so that it can enter into force. The second concrete work stream is actually the second wave of negotiations that were mandated by the decision that adopted the agreement and by the agreement itself. So again, on concrete steps, the big question that I think we have to think of now, and members will need to think what they really want to see from the second wave, is what exactly do we need to negotiate now? So based on the achievement that or the outcome that we achieved in MC12, what is left to negotiate? And we have to start there, because of course there are diverging views on what exactly we should start negotiating on. So on the 10th of October, there will be a retreat of WTO members where that will be the basic idea. Take a step back and start discussing what now? How can we keep on negotiating? What exactly do we have to negotiate? And hopefully try to find between the discussions some sort of internal mandate or at least a work program for the following months in how to conclude this second wave of negotiations. So we have two sort of deadlines. One is by Article 12 of the agreement that establishes that 4 years after the entry into force of the agreement, it will be automatically terminated if we don't achieve that outcome of the second wave of negotiations. That, of course, can be avoided by a decision of members as well. And then we have a second deadline that is the decision itself from ministers that says that hopefully by MC13, the negotiating group on rules would be able to provide recommendations and suggestions to the ministers that they can adopt so that we can conclude this second wave of negotiations. So the aim is to do that by MC13. The hard deadline is 4 years after the entry into force, but I certainly do hope that we don't extend that deadline until the 4 years. So we are looking at working hard the next following months under a basic structure to really find that outcome by MC13.
So I think here we've heard from each of the speakers that they see stakeholders as having a critical role, not just in forging ways forward, but in helping to implement the kinds of agreements and putting pressure on governments to implement at the national level. Here, I think a really key thing that stakeholders can do is to help build these conversations at the national level in capitals, ensuring that countries have the evidence that they need, the policy options to consider, and so on. So breaking down these silos between environment and trade policymaking at the national level is as important as it is here at the international level. Ho asked me to close by mentioning there are further opportunities for discussions like these. The WTO has an Environment Week annually alongside the Committee on Trade and Environment meetings in just a few weeks, so I'm sure you'll hear more about that. Many members and stakeholders are hosting events that week. So I'll just close by thanking the WTO and UNEP for co-hosting their session today here at the Geneva Trade Week. I'd like to thank my colleagues Dimitri and also Juanita from Geneva Trade Platform for putting together such a seamless event today. We have many, many people online, many more than we have in the room here, so it's great to know that. And this recording will also be available afterwards for viewing of others. At TESS, we're very proud to support this work. And finally, wanted to thank all of you as participants for joining us and for taking this work forward. And we hope, we know that there are varied views on how best to take this forward, but what's important is that the engagement of stakeholders in making the effort and pushing everyone to act faster and better. Thank you so much.
Thank you.